Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 20th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maya Changseliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at Oxford. These seminars are jointly organized by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. Before introducing our speaker, let me attend to a few administrative points. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online in due course. We have a dedicated YouTube section in the Department of Education YouTube channel, so there are all the recordings of previous webinars as well available if you are interested. We only record the first half of this webinar, the presentation itself. We won't be recording the Q&A session. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been invited to speak. If you want to ask a question or share your comment, please use the chat function first to write out a question or to indicate that you wish to speak. At the end of the presentation, I will select those questions and comments and will invite you to ask your question or to share your comment yourself. When I invite you, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, state your name, where you are from, and share your question. Okay, so let me introduce our speaker. I am delighted to host today Professor Tejendra Pherali. Tejendra is Professor of Education, Conflict and Peace at UCL Institute of Education in London, where he leads the research theme on education, conflict and peace building. He is the chair of British Association of International and Comparative Education, that we know as BASE. He also chairs the editorial board of one of the most prominent journals in our field, Compare. Tejendra's research primarily focuses on educational challenges in conflict-affected and humanitarian situations. He leads the AHRC-funded Peace with Justice Network and is also a co-investigator on ESRC funding Relief Center that aims to promote innovative educational practices in conflict-affected contexts. Tejendra is the author of the book Conflict, Education and Peace in Nepal, Rebuilding Education for Peace and Development, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2022. He is also the editor of Education and Conflict Review. Today's talk is titled From Perpetrator to Peace Builder, Rethinking Education in Conflict-Affected Societies. I will stop here now and I will pass over to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, for this very generous introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to come to this event and share some of my thoughts and ideas about the work that I've been doing for many, many years. And thank you for hosting me, and thank you everyone for joining the meeting today. So I have a PowerPoint, so I'd like to share it first. Just a minute. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, thank you.
That's lovely. So as Maya just said, my work primarily focuses on education in low-income and conflict-affected contexts where education is affected by violence, political instability, and state fragility. So more recently, I have been working in refugee settings such as Lebanon, Jordan, and at the borders of Myanmar and Thailand, where we are trying to find new ways of supporting teaching and learning, teacher professional development, and supporting a host country policy debates around how to make education policies that are relevant to the learners from refugee communities. So what I'm hoping to do is to talk about some of these ideas that you can see on this slide, trying to look at education from a conflict perspective. that the focus really here is that education is usually seen as the positive good for peace and human flourishing. The idea that we should educate more people, we need to provide more education, and we would be able to achieve progress and prosperity. So this field or subfield, if you like, of education, conflict, and peace tries to look into this interrelationships between education in a broad sense, not necessarily just what happens in schools, but as a process of learning, if you like, and societal dimensions, politics, culture, history, economy, and so forth. But education can also become part of the problem in fueling the drivers of conflict, and therefore the process of education needs to be examined critically. And I think this particular idea of education being a problem in creating, reproducing, and fueling violent conflicts is not very much sort of researched, or at least not embedded in educational programmings in conflict-affected settings. But then also the idea that education indeed contributes to peace and social justice. So I'm going to assume that the audience here is generally interested in the role of education in societal change and human development, but not necessarily is the specialist in the rapidly growing field of education and conflict. So what I would like to do is to present 4 different concepts that I have developed through my research, and then eventually I will try to present a framework of analysis which would enable researchers, policymakers, and graduate students, of course, to try to understand the intersections between education and conflict more critically. So let me first share with you the first concept, which is education as victim of conflict. So I'm sure you've heard of a militant group called Boko Haram in Nigeria. So Boko Haram targets schools for teaching English, maths, and science, and for the enrollment of girls in schools. So it's literally meaning Western education is forbidden. Boko Haram's hostile ideology towards secular education has gained notoriety for its repeated attacks on primary and secondary schools and teachers, administrators, and students that promote liberal ideas, education for employable skills, and international dimensions. Particularly, the gruesome attacks took place in 2014 and 2018, when about 279 and 110 schoolgirls in Chibok and Dapchi towns, respectively, were kidnapped by Boko Haram. This news made international headlines, and I'm sure many of you heard those news and read about those events, with many of the girls still remaining in captivity. Today, the region's educational activities are grossly disrupted, and UNICEF in 2019 reported that about 802 schools remain closed, 497 classrooms have been destroyed, while about over 1,000 classrooms have been damaged. This has resulted in about 2.8 million children needing education and emergency support in the conflict-affected states of Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa. The situation has placed Nigeria on top of the list of countries with a high number of out-of-school children. So notably, it is not only the rebel groups that disrupt educational routine, but also government forces who occupy school premises for military purposes are also disrupting educational processes. Additionally, Government forces that are deployed to protect schools from militant attacks put schools in risk of being caught in the crossfire between the conflicting parties. The potential risk of violence in the school surroundings results in the long-term psychological vulnerability of teachers and students, and victimization of education also occurs through denial of girls' access to schools. Some of the scholars point out that girls in northern Nigeria have low levels of education and tend to get married at an early age since the Boko Haram kidnapping in 2014 and 2018. Enrollment of girls has been declining. And these events continue to happen even more recently. In 2021, about 79 young people, school children, were kidnapped from schools in northern Nigeria. So also there is a lot of evidence around educational stakeholders being attacked by violent groups across the world. And there's an organization called Global Coalition for Protecting Education from Attack, which reports annually the attacks on education across the world. So in 2021, 2022, more than 5,000 attacks on education and incidents of military use of schools were and schools and universities were reported, harming about 9,000 students and educators in at least 85 different countries. Which is on average, there were 6 attacks or military use of schools reported each day. What is also striking is that the attacks or threats of attacks on schools and students and teachers have increased, and the military use of schools and universities have more than doubled in 2021 and 2022. So this scenario illustrates the way education has become a victim of violent conflicts that have occurred around the world. One of the reasons for attacks on education is that education represents the authority of the state, and schools are one of the very few institutions that are widely spread across the state territory, implementing the state's economic, social, and political visions. So I'll just go back to this slide for now. So where rebel groups do not have the military strength to directly face the state authorities or state security forces, they are more likely to attack schools as soft targets, and schools and teachers and school children's coming to this attack, and the news of the attacks actually serves for their propaganda tool. Attacks on education causes deep levels of psychological stress on populations, and rebel groups tend to benefit from the political pressures created by their violent acts. The national education policies, curriculum, and pedagogical practices may also be perceived as assimilative, repressive, and offensively ideological to the culturally diverse communities. For example, the Maoist insurgents in Nepal, the case I will present in detail a little bit later, attacked schools that taught Sanskrit as a subject and burnt down Sanskrit textbooks during the rebellion to challenge oppressive caste-based structures that aspects of Sanskrit education legitimized. In Afghanistan, schools are attacked by the Taliban and ISIS for promoting Western-style education and educating girls. But also the violent conflicts cause mass displacement of vulnerable populations, as we've seen the refugee crisis across the world, which has debilitating impacts on the educational life of children. So at the end of 2019, violent conflicts and natural disasters have caused the forced displacement of almost 82.4 million people worldwide, of which 26.4 million have been living as refugees. and around half of the refugee populations is under the age of 18, with less than half having access to education. It is estimated that 38% of primary-aged school children are out of school, whereas merely 37% of the secondary-aged young people have access to secondary education. So access to higher education is dismally about 6% among refugee populations, with a target of reaching 15% by 2015, as the international communities have pledged. Refugee youth face the risk of being recruited in armed groups and forced into child labor and sexual exploitation, whilst they miss out the opportunity to gain sort of knowledge and skills to live productive and independent lives. Worryingly, the refugee crisis caused by violent conflicts of climate emergencies is increasingly becoming protracted. An average length of exile has reached about 25 years in 33 protracted refugee situations at the end of 2014, nearly 3 times as long as in early 1990s, creating prolonged vulnerability and marginalization for both displaced and host communities. Given the protracted nature of displacement, a refugee child's entire period of school and tertiary education is spent in exile, resulting in increasing demands for secondary and higher education. And some of the reasons for attacks on education, as I pointed out earlier, as schools serving as tactical sort of targets, education serving as propaganda tool, but also education being sort of seen as a process of cultural repression, but also forced recruitments of young people for child soldiering, because children are vulnerable to recruitment because of the lack of appreciation of the level of risks that is involved in participating in violence. But also they're kind of cheaper for recruiting groups to keep because they eat less, and also they're likely to take more sort of dangerous acts when they are in the battle. Also, some of the colleagues have talked about how security forces have utilized education in sort of addressing or trying to achieve the military goals, the 3D approach, where education becomes a part of the process. So now the second idea that I would like to present is education as a perpetrator, which fuels violent conflict. And I would like to present this case of the Maoist rebellion in Nepal, which, as I'm native of Nepal and have done quite a lot of research over the years, education in Nepal has historically been restricted to the social elites, high caste, hill-based sort of men particularly, and also language policies, education policies in general, curricular contents, and so forth, have been hugely monopolized by those who have controlled power. And the state has historically adopted a policy of assimilation. Nepal is a diverse country with various religions, ethnic groups, caste groups, and so forth. Yet the education policy and curricular contents and processes have largely represented the ideologies, cultures, and social ways of living of the people who have controlled power. Military history has been hugely glorified in curricular materials, and the history of Nepal is that various territories that were inhabited by various cultural and ethnic groups were merged in an imperial campaign of the Gurkha state. And those diversities have been completely neglected, and for a very long time, the state has promoted a monolithic policy of one language, one dress code, loyalty to monarchy, and a particular vision of national identity in which the diverse social groups and ethnic groups have been marginalized. Children from low caste and ethnic minorities have fallen behind in education because of the issue relating to the language of instruction, but also widespread exclusions that they experience in their societies, as well as in the educational settings. And the Maoist rebellion was launched in 1996 in order to redress some of these inequalities. And one of the main agendas of the Maoist was abolition of the monarchy, which was the leader of this hegemonic production of nation building that excluded marginalized communities and low caste groups or other ethnic communities, and also gender equality and inclusion of historically deprived communities in the processes of political decision making. So the conflict cost about 17,000 people. Finally, with the signing of the peace agreement in 2006 and the political transition that followed, eventually sort of leading to the promulgation of a new constitution in 2015. So as this particular case points out, that education has become part of the production of all of those inequalities. And it's not only in the case of Nepal, but more widely, there's a growing body of literature that examines the contested role of education in the production and exacerbation of violence. So formal education that lacks conflict sensitivity may be socially destructive when it fails to address problems around unequal access to and quality of education, maintains a segregated and unjust educational provision, promotes biased history through curriculum and textbooks, and maintains exclusionary educational practices in which ethnic, cultural, and religious minorities are deprived of the rights to learn in their mother tongue. In particular, the policy on language of instruction is a significant issue, given that the instruction in the mother tongue during primary years can achieve far better results than that in a non-native language. The imposition of the dominant language through formal education on multilingually diverse ethnic and indigenous communities can serve as a repressive force and is a way of destroying a group's resource base and eroding the very essence of their life that constitutes culture, traditions, and identity. So state-controlled education systems tend to privilege historical knowledge and cultural values of the ruling political class through formalized curriculum, pedagogical practices, and assessment mechanisms, as I pointed out when I presented the case of Nepal. So in this process, social groups with less power are obscured in what is considered legitimate and accredited knowledge in the formal education systems. History textbooks often contain narratives of self-glorification and demonization of the national enemy, which serve for production and hardening of nationalist ideologies. History curricula and textbooks that provide dominant narratives about the past shape social, cultural, and political struggles in contemporary societies. There are widespread examples from around the world where formal education has been complicit in fueling grievances among the marginalized groups. The dominance of hill high castes and their native language on ethnic minorities in Nepal, as I presented earlier, depiction of Tamils as the historical other in Sinhalese textbooks in Sri Lanka, the misrepresentation of the World War II atrocities caused by Japanese troops in China and Korea, which I will talk a little bit more about in a second. all exemplify how education can become a problem from a conflict perspective. In Rwanda, the post-independence educational policies and the ethnicity-based quota system prevented many Tutsi children from access to education. Even though educational exclusion was not the primary cause of genocide, it was an integral part of wider structural violence on Tutsis. Similarly, an analysis of multi-nation civic textbooks reveals that in Cyprus, Argentina, post-genocide Rwanda, China, South Africa, and Mozambique, textbooks promote a discourse of cultural assimilation rather than celebrating diversity, while strong elements of ethnic nationalism and prejudices were found in textbooks from Bosnia, Herzegovina, North Korea, China, Romania, Serbia, Croatia, and Ukraine. So with reference to the above examples that we just discussed, education can help preserve the meta-narratives of powerful groups and promote contestation of intergroup relations and exclusion and marginalization. So now I'd like to present to you the third concept, which is education as liberation. So in this concept, I would like to present the third scenario that points out education's role as a liberator. Here, I want to come to the case of Colombia, where we've done some work around social movement learning. So despite the fanfare surrounding the historical peace deal between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, in 2017, officially ending 50 years of internal war, Colombia is experiencing deep socio-ecological challenges surrounding land tenure and a neoliberal system, exacerbating inequality and biodiversity loss. Given the importance of education in bringing forth the necessary transformations towards more environmentally sustainable societies, a particular challenge for Colombia is its education system, especially in rural areas, with low coverage, lack of quality and equity, and in need of making itself relevant for rural communities and responsive to the social and environmental needs of its population. Yet, in the Freirean philosophy, Colombia has a tradition of participatory action research, which promotes a form of reflexive research and learning, which addresses local challenges through participatory action. In community settings, often characterized by marginalization, such learning can place participants as the protagonists of the learning process, transforming the expert role of the teacher into one of facilitation. So we were involved in a research project in collaboration with a local organization called Intercultural Universities of the Peoples, where local peasants, young people, and social movement activists came together to talk about some of the pressing issues that their communities faced, to talk about how to protect themselves from paramilitary forces and dominance of neoliberal policies, land grabbing, and expansion of multinational companies in their territories. So it was a process of learning through those real challenges that the communities were facing and developing those capacities in order to challenge some of those oppressive processes that they were experiencing in their communities. So people learn through these practical projects in their own community with a focus on traditional knowledge, emotional learning, and skills such as conflict resolution, whereby education becomes a tool for personal and community development. In this way, community-based learning can help decolonize educational paradigms through participation of different ontological communities in learning processes, engage students in practical challenges which directly relate to their community, as well as contribute to social justice in teacher formation. Because of community-based learning's commitment to inclusion, participation, and supporting community processes such as local governance, community-based learning plays an important role in mitigating conflict and promoting reconciliation and coexistence in divided and post-conflict societies. So in this scenario, education can be viewed through the lens of liberation, whereby the goal is for reaching and learning to promote emancipation from oppressive societal structures through transformation towards social justice and democracy. At the heart of the educational current is the field of critical pedagogy, founded by the Brazilian philosopher and educator Paulo Freire in his seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The Freirean philosophy believes in the awakening of the critical consciousness through critical reflection of everyday power structures. Beyond deeper understandings of one's personal circumstances, an important aspect of conscientization, which Freire coined the term that many of you must be familiar with, I hope, is praxis, action-based change, which challenges oppressive power structures. Critical pedagogy has been critiqued and expanded upon, such as an added focus on the critical pedagogy of place, and highlighting the importance of humanization, the process of becoming in human development. Elsewhere, my colleague Aaron McGee and I have made connections between the Freirean philosophy and education in refugee settings, where we emphasize its important contributions in peace building, especially the importance of not just responding to livelihood needs through education, but also engaging in critical debates about structures and cultures that reproduce unequal power relations. The necessity for marginalized populations to transgress oppressive power structures and co-create new collective narratives of human development has been emphasized in the emergent concept of, as Bell Hooks calls, transgressive learning, with examples such as protagonizing community actors in non-formal grassroots learning and the contextual aspects of pedagogical practices in the classroom in resistance to the neoliberal educational paradigm, etc. Such as liberating perspective of education in particularly important in contexts such as Colombia, where a peace accord has officially been signed, but where deep structural inequalities remain largely unaddressed. The cultural landscapes of a classroom serve as a microcosm of the broader community within which the educational processes take place. And that's why the types of inequalities, discriminations that we see in the communities are also equally reflected in the educational settings, informal educational settings. Educational spaces, both involving formal learning at schools, as well as community-level domains of resistance to hegemonic structures, as in the case of Colombia, as I talked about, offer hope for liberatory educational experiences. The idea that pupils and educators are passive recipients of hegemonic curricula imposed by the state and can therefore do nothing about the banking model of education, as Freire calls, and its role in reproducing social inequalities, I think, is essentially flawed. It is important to recognize that resistance to the structural determinants of the education system can also emerge from within the autonomy of a school, where the space of the classroom and its surrounding communities can be exploited and expanded by educators in order to exercise counter-hegemonic pedagogies. And I think this doesn't necessarily need to be something very different kind of educational process. It needs to underpin the educational provision, whatever it might be, so that education serves for the skills that are required to attain livelihood, but also it provides those essential dimensions that enable young people to be able to play the political role in the context where they live in, and also the future they want to create in other places or the countries of origin, if you like, if they are refugee populations. So in this process, the role of teachers is crucial, in which they engage in transformative educational practices by empowering learners to challenge dominant structures and engaging themselves in social actions that problematize the status quo. Now, the fourth concept that I would like to talk about, and this is the last one, is the idea that education is also a peace builder. Now, this was the case that I wanted to talk about, that I briefly mentioned earlier, that the World War II events in Northeast Asia are still very problematic, and educational processes often come across these issues in terms of the kinds of narratives that are promoted through history curriculum, or generally through learning, formal and informal learning in these different societies. So there are different kinds of narratives about Japan's invasion on China, narratives about Nanking massacre, where between 200 to 300,000 soldiers and civilians were killed, and 20 to 80,000 women were reportedly raped. And also there's been an issue of comfort women. The Korean young women were forcibly recruited by the Imperial Army of Japan during the World War II, and there's always been a sort of controversies around compensation or reparation for those atrocities. So these are very troubling historical events for all of these countries, and these narratives are sort of shared and promoted and reproduced quite differently across three nations. So there has been some positive initiative around this, and one of those is the Common History Textbook Initiative in Northeast Asia. It's a collaborative work of nearly 50 Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean scholars, which was published in 2005 in the form of a joint history textbook and intended for middle school students in each of the three countries. The textbook was published a few years after the Japanese government endorsed several history textbooks that were considered factually inaccurate and extremely biased against other Asian nations, particularly China and South Korea. After protests from the South Korean and Chinese governments and the refusal of many Japanese teachers to use the controversial Japanese textbooks, the Japanese government agreed to work with the governments of Korea, South Korea, and China to produce a cooperative regional history textbook that would provide content and a narrative that all three nations would agree upon. To address conflicts in the region, the scholars agreed to present controversial issues from different standpoints and to avoid judgments in the textbook. So, for example, Japanese and Korean participants had a strong disagreement about the legality of various treaties signed between the two governments in modern times. The project participants decided to avoid taking sides and represent different narratives, leaving the judgment to the readers. All other controversial topics were examined from all sides of the debate. This initiative has produced the textbook that teachers can use as complementary materials in addition to standard history textbooks. The purpose of the resulting textbook is incidentally recognized in its subtitle, which is Facing the Future Using History as a Mirror, Building Together a New Framework of Peace and Friendship in East Asia. The book's use as a tool for reconciliation and peace building is also highlighted in 3 separate prefaces written by editors from each of the nations and directed towards students in the other nations. So like education for liberation, as I discussed earlier, education for peace building is characterized by an action-oriented, multidisciplinary learning process that goes beyond the knowledge-based classroom activity about peace. The aim of such an education is to build capacities in learners to interrupt the continuum of violence, which may be symbolic, structural, or physical, as Johan Galtung has extensively written about. In this sense, the curriculum for peace building demands critical classroom-based interactions with practical activities that relate to social, cultural, and political issues and are based in the local communities. And Bush and Salterelli, in their very first, very widely cited edited report, which was published by UNICEF in 2000. And they argued that peace-building education should involve, and I quote, a bottom-up rather than top-down process driven by war-torn societies themselves, founded on their experiences and capacities, firmly rooted in immediate realities, not in abstract ideas or theories. And later, Jill and Niens have provided a useful synthesis of diverse theoretical frameworks to a framework for peace building through education. They suggest that a dialogic humanizing pedagogy that builds on the foundations of critical theory and the Freirean pedagogy of participation, emancipation, and transformation can overcome the limitations of the narrow economic model of education to inculcate fundamental attributes of humanity, love, compassion, and humility. Educational policies that promote equitable access to education can benefit socioeconomically disadvantaged populations, through which potentially ethnic tensions can be minimized. Schools can, for example, promote instruction in the mother tongue of the region, especially in early years, rather than imposing a dominant national language on minority groups. Nevertheless, peace-building initiatives in conflict-affected environments lack explicit links to peace-building theories and tend to focus on immediate humanitarian needs with a greater emphasis on protection and reconstruction, which of course is definitely important, rather than transformation that requires a more explicit commitment to political, economic, and social change. And I think this is significant given that education is a long-term investment. It might be seen as a response to the economic needs of the struggling populations in these very poverty-stricken, deprived, and challenging environments, but learning processes should equally contribute to build those long-term visions that these young people would, or all learners would be part of in the future. Now, recently, well, maybe like 5 years ago, I suppose, you know.
I also remind you, perhaps we could leave a few minutes for questions and answers.
Sure, I'll finish in like 2 minutes.
Thank you.
So basically, this particular framework that colleagues came up with, Mario Novelli and colleagues, they built on this Nancy Fraser's social justice theory to present the 4R framework, where they talk about the idea of redistribution, recognition, representation, and reconciliation, you know, in redressing the causes of conflict through education in conflict-affected societies. There's also the more practical system-level reforms which various development organizations promote through governance, security reforms, social education serving the social causes such as promotion of human rights, social cohesion, and so forth. And most importantly, as we know, the human capital logic of education, where education helps build skills, jobs and livelihood opportunities. So finally, my take-home messages for us are very simple, basically, that this particular framework, as I presented through various examples, I hope provides a useful tool to understand education more critically from sort of multi-directional point of view, that education is not always a vehicle for peace and social justice. It needs to be examined in terms of the type of education on offer, and it needs to contribute to equity, fairness, and justice. And finally, I suppose we should be aiming for transforming education from it becoming a victim or perpetrator to becoming a liberator or peace builder. So thank you, and I'll leave it there.